All right, I am going to do a quick thing on creating roles and assigning permissions in Postgres. I will use my little bit of an apartment database here. So I've got everything up. Let's go back. I'm going to close this. We'll just do apartment. We'll do schemas and then tables. As I said, I don't have this fully functional, but I can do at least there. Let's say down at the bottom here, there's a thing login, group, and roles. So if you look at that, there are some built-in roles. Postgres is the one that we've been using. It's the kind of has all privileges. We could create another role. I'm not going to give it a name right now, but when you look at the definition, it'll give a password and it'll do all of that. And it gives you some basic permissions. These aren't very specific though. So I am going to do this mostly with the SQL. SQL gives you a lot more permissions, a lot more power. So I am going to, on apartment, I'm going to get the query tool. And let's create a role for tenants. I'm going to create a role tenant. Okay. And this one won't have a login. We'll give everybody individual logins. So I'm going to execute. Okay, so we should have a role. If I go down here to table spaces, not table spaces, to roles, and if I refresh, there'll be a role tenant. So I am going to assign some permissions to tenant. So we will do grant select. Okay, so they can look at on, and I'm going to we'll just say on apartment, and I'm going to quote it because I think it needs quoted in this apartment, and we're going to grant it to tenant. Okay. Let's also, because they're going to need to be able to make their payment. Do I have a payment table there? I do not. But we will grant a select on lease. To tenant, so they can look at their lease. We'll fix that later. All right, and let's do grant update on tenant, so they can do their own. They can update their own things to tenant. I kind of wish I had not named the role tenant. I'm going to fix that actually before I run the other things. I am going to drop role tenant. So that'll get rid of it. So I'm going to run that one line. All right. And then I am going to create role tenant role. Just to be clear about what it is. So I will create that role. And then these have to be tenant rolled in. Right, the capitalization won't matter, but it has to be tenant role. So each of these is granting a permission to tenant role. I'm going to execute that. They were successful. So when you do this, permissions are things that it can do. So somebody who is a member of a tenant role can do select, which means they can look at it. They can select on lease. They can update tenant. They also should be, in order to update tenant, they will have to see it. So grant select on tenant to tenant role. We would probably want to create some stored procedures and things to handle this, but those are the roles. Now, let's take a tenant. Do I have any tenants? This is just to look. Just to look and see who I have in tenant. I have to quote it because of the way that it was created. Well, but I got the quotes in the wrong place. All right. So I've got John Doe, John Smith and Jane Doe. So we'll create a role for, so I'm going to create role we'll just do it like this. John Smith with password equals, okay, password equals, and we will call it, I'm just going to do password. All right. It's a bad password, but we're going to create that role. Oh. Okay, so no equal sign there. All right, now John Smith has 0 permissions, but we're going to give him the tenant permissions. So I am going to add I'm going to try this. Grant John Smith. Trying to remember the syntax for this. I think it's grant tenant role to John Smith. Let's see if that works. If it doesn't work, I will look it up. Tenant role does not exist. Yes, it does. Oh, I got an extra T in there. Okay, so that's successful. So John Smith should be a member of tenant. So let's do refresh. Okay, so now we have a tenant role. And if I right click and look at the properties, and I want to look at the membership, well, let's look at John Smith then. John Smith, properties, membership is tenant role. Okay, so let's try to log in as John Smith and see if we can do these things. So, couple of things that I'm going to do as a comment. So let's just do, I'm going to do a quick comment. Permissions consist of permissions consist of commands, of SQL commands. And those commands contain things are like select, insert, update, execute, delete, drop. You could also give them things like create and alter. So those are basically all the commands. And anything that is not granted is denied. So it has to be explicitly granted for it to work. So I'm going to comment that. All right. The other principle that I'll add right here is that a user should be given all the permissions necessary to do their job, to do what they need to do. But no more. And there's the cat. All right. So let's try this John Smith. So there's a couple of ways to do this. I am going to stop, right click on this server and disconnect the server. I'm going to right click and go on the properties, and I'm going to, for the connection, I am going to say that the user this time is going to be John Smith. All right, I'm going to save that, and then I'm going to reconnect. Notice it says that it wants the password for the user John Smith. So I'm going to do password. I'm going to check on that. Yep. I'm going to do OK. It says John Smith is not permitted to log in. They should be. We did it with oh, you know what? All right, so let's go back. I forgot one thing when I created the role John Smith. I forgot to add with login. So connection will go back to Postgres. Okay, now I will connect, and I will do the Postgres password. All right. So when I created the thing, I said with password, but I didn't say login. Let's see if I can alter the role. I am going to real quickly check on Postgres. PostgreSQL. I'm going to check on alter role to log in. Okay, so let's see what the documentation says. So let's find a example. Okay, so it says with alter role. We're going to change John Smith. So I'm going to say alter role John Smith with login. Let's see if it works. Continue. All right, so it's good. So let's try it again. So I am going to, actually before I do the properties, I am going to disconnect the server. I'm going to go to properties, and I'm going to, for the connection, say John Smith. I'm going to save. I'm going to connect the server, and I am going to, so it's for John Smith, so it should be password. Going to do OK, and notice that John Smith did connect. I'm going to create a new I'm going to do a new query tool, and I'm going to select star from apartment. It should work. And it does. Let's try to do update apartment. Update apart. Because we don't have this permission. I'm going to say set bedrooms equal 3, where apartment number equals 102. So this should fail. Oh, I have an extra. I wanted a semicolon there. Okay, let's try it again. Oh, this needs to be quoted also because of the way I created the database. Oh, bedrooms. What is the... Same problem. This needs to be quoted. So finally we get the error that I wanted. Permission was denied. So to specify again, and I'll put all this code in things. So first of all, I'm going to go stop the server again, disconnect the server. I'm going to go to properties. I'm going to go back to the connection, change it to Postgres. I'm going to save. I'm going to connect and do the right password. Do OK. And then I'll show you. So when we did, this was our original thing. I created the role tenant role. I granted select on apartment to tenant role, select update on tenant, and select on tenant to tenant role. We created the role John Smith with password. I forgot to add the word login, but I changed that later to add it to login. And we granted the tenant role to John Smith, which means that John Smith gets all of the privileges, permissions that are inside the tenant role. So I'm going to kill that, because if you do it right, you wouldn't have to do that. I'm going to stop the video. I am going to post it and post the code.